Many of you have said that it was difficult to get here today, and this evening I'm going to share my testimony, and God said I have to share every miserable moment of my life. And I want you to know that because I shared my testimony 8.5 years ago at a Celebrate Recovery, and God did not have me share every miserable moment, okay? But I want you to know that God can redeem every miserable moment and get you to the point where you can talk in front of women. I'm guessing that some of you are struggled to get here tonight because my miserable moments match your miserable moments, and that may trigger you. I am, amongst other things, I am trained in some counseling, and so I know that if I trigger, you will shut down. If you shut down, please find somebody with the little things and talk to them, or write it on a prayer thing, or come talk to me afterwards, because once you shut down, you're not going to hear anything else. So that's why I want to tell you up front, it doesn't matter what you've been through, what you've done, what's happened in your life, God can restore it all. Right. Hold on to that as we go through this together. So my name is Karen Laing, and hopefully you are all here for the weekend of What's in Your Wardrobe, right? Yes? Okay, yes. Good. All right. And I have a couple of different roles, but I teach publicly under my nonprofit called Apple of His Eye Services. And I write books under there, and I write books on healthcare as well. And so that's my email on the front of each of those slides. If you need something, business cards are on the back. Reach out to me at any time. It doesn't have to be this weekend. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I just wanted to give you a little bit about my family. Over here on the far end is the last picture that was taken when I was a fully functional family with my husband and my 4 children. The picture in the middle was taken about 4 years ago. This child right here was born by emergency C-section 5.5 weeks early, and Lisa West was in the room with me at the time it happened. Which is just so cool. This is my son's girlfriend. This was my kids' Christmas card last year. I asked them, as a Christmas present, to replicate that picture. This is what they did. I got kids, what can I say? Next picture. My son and his girlfriend Samantha, though, created my grandbaby. And she is absolutely the joy of my life. And she looks exactly like her daddy, except her eyes are brown like her mom, and her hair is curly like her mom's. But other than that, she is just a sweetheart. So I want to start this testimony with the next slide, which are the life verses that God gave me. All right, and I want you to, as you're listening, to hear, I'm not going to throw these verses back out again, but hear where they appear in my life, because they appear in my life over and over and over again. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as He told me. Acts 27:25. I have this all on a PowerPoint. If anybody wants the PowerPoints afterwards, I can email them to you. Never doubt God's mighty power to work in you and accomplish all this. He will achieve infinitely more than your greatest request, your most unbelievable dream, and exceed your wildest imagination. He will outdo them all, for His miraculous power constantly energizes you. That's Ephesians 8:20. That's from the Passion Translation, which is one of my favorite ways to read things because it's passionate. And then my last one. As for you, the anointing you received from Him remains in you, and you do not need anyone to teach you. But as His anointing teaches you about all things, and as that anointing is real and not counterfeit, just as it has taught you, remain in Him. And that guides everything I do. I don't seek outside of myself, of God, when I am putting together a class. I don't read books on it. I don't research from the backside. I head to the Bible and I talk to the Holy Spirit, and together we put these classes together. So I started out in life as a daddy's girl. I was a daddy's girl from my earthly father, and I was a daddy's girl from my heavenly Father as well. I accepted Christ at the age of 6, and I was given the gift of faith when I did that. I have just known since I was little that God can handle anything. That doesn't mean I always followed that, but it's what I believed in the beginning. My life, though, was an emotionally unstable mess and weirdness. I didn't understand it. Both of my parents were Christians. They went to church. They raised me. They served in the church. They were strong Christians. But there was just this weirdness that I couldn't quite put my hands on. I didn't understand what was going on. And he, instead of drinking, ate all the time. But it wasn't, as it turns out, my dad. My earthly dad taught me his addiction, though. And my Abba Father Daddy taught me to listen to the words, "Not this way, daughter." So I went through a back and forth. At age 12, I also learned about alcohol. By age 14, God said, "Not this way, daughter." In the person of my cousin Robert, who had just come out of rehab for hardcore alcohol and drug addiction, and came to live with my family for a year. And he looked at me about 2 weeks into his stay, and he said, "Who's going to take you in when you come out of rehab? Your father was the only family member who would take me in." And I realized I needed to stop then. And I did. I was really blessed. A year later, most of my friends that I'd been drinking with had moved to hardcore drugs, and many of them were in juvie or had been kicked out of the school district. But I was clean and sober. But I was still living with some weirdness. At 16, I overdosed on aspirin, of all things, which, yes, you can kill yourself with that I had researched in a suicide attempt. I spent the night vomiting all of that up, and my mother was up several times during the night checking on me and asking what was wrong and thinking that when I stopped vomiting, she'd go back downstairs and go back to bed, and then I'd start again. In the morning, my mother sent me to school. She told me that if I had been up throwing up all night, she would have certainly known that, and she was not aware of it, and so I was going to school, even though she'd been up several times during the night with me. It was just another one of those weirdnesses that just did not make any sense. And yet immediately after that, I heard the still small voice of God say, "You will understand, and it's time to grow up." I got involved with a church group, and I got involved with my youth retreat, and I was totally excited and raring to go and fully engaged with God. And then we heard announcements about what was to happen on the retreat. There was to be no drugs and alcohol in this retreat because you were not legally old enough to do so. And you were not to have sex on this retreat because it would be embarrassing if somebody tripped over you and somebody else having sex. So guess what Karen learned from that discussion? Sex is the answer. As I tried the alcohol and I saw what my friends had done with the drugs, but sex is just embarrassing if somebody finds you. So as long as I'm not found, I'm golden. Was sex the answer? Absolutely not. But, I tried it anyway. And I definitely remember hearing the still small voice of God say, "No, that was a bad idea and not at all what I meant, and don't do it." But, I'm 16. I know things. 6 years later, I've survived a couple of sexual partners. I was, for my friends, pretty pure in that area. But I had an abusive boyfriend and an abortion. And God said, "Not this way, daughter." And he pulled me out of where I was living with a phone call from a friend and an offer to move to Florida away from him. She had no idea what was going on, but she just wanted me there in Florida with her. And I took it and I fled. A few months later, I had to return to New York State because my father was having a heart bypass and medical interventions. And as I was here helping my mom and my dad, I watched my father go through the heart surgery and then begin to recover, and my mother go straight downhill. My mother, 4 years earlier, had finished nursing school, a lifelong dream she'd had. And she was a really good nurse. But she couldn't handle his care. She couldn't handle life anymore. It was the oddest thing. We'd go to the doctor and she wouldn't seem to understand what he was saying about medications and diet and exercise and all of those kinds of normal things that happen after you've had bypass surgery. But God settled my heart there. He settled me there. He had me stay. I wasn't going to stay, but with my mom being so unable to handle life and not being sure what would happen if my dad was there with my mom who wasn't handling life, I stayed. I graduated with a degree in early childhood education. I became a youth group leader in the same church that had set me off on the wrong direction. But this time I was bound and determined not to do that to my kids. I watched friends get married, and I decided that I was going to be at the ripe old age of 23. The Apostle Paul, right? The Apostle Paul talks about, if you need to get married, but it's better if you're single, That was me. It's better if I was single. Absolutely. And then one Sunday I woke up, and I was irritated, and I did not want to go to church. And God said, not that way, daughter. Get up and get dressed and go. So instead of driving my own car, I hopped in the car with my parents, which I never did, and I went to church with my parents. I'd always gone to their church, but I drove myself. And I got there, and I met a man during the prayer time. And I was just like, who is that? And I heard in the back of my head, that's your husband. And flooding back came a dream I had the day after I tried to commit suicide of meeting my husband in church during the passing of the peace. And in fact, every guy that I had dragged to church during the passing of the peace, I would start crying because somehow in my soul, I knew this wasn't the guy. And so he had actually, I lived in a church that was not, I didn't think it was a difficult church to find, but nobody could ever find my church. Like I would tell my friends to come and we would be doing some event and people would be like, I couldn't find your church. And he found us. He had found us. He was looking for an apartment. He found us the day before. He found us the next morning. I introduced myself to him. And over the next 18 months, we went through a courtship with some really difficult circumstances. My mother's behavior was getting weirder and stranger, and we just couldn't get a handle on what she was doing. And my husband's parents were in the middle of the nastiest divorce. We were both working though. We were both loving what we were doing. We were enjoying each other's company and going out and walking and talking and seeing the vision that God had for our lives together. And one day my boss came to me and said, I want you to move to Albany, New York. We have a lot more stores up there. I was managing a kids' shoe store. We have a lot more stores up there. We think we really need you up there. And I went, well, I got to talk that over with Jim because we're about to get married and, And the same day, and I'm thinking, I can't do this. He just moved to this area 18 months ago, 16 months ago. I can't ask him to move. This is the area he chose to live in. Same day, his boss comes to him and says, we're opening a location in Albany, and we want you to go there. And he thought, I can't ask Karen. This is where her parents are. She's had us about, she's lived other places, but she came back here. She's not going to leave. So we sat at dinner that night, neither one of us barely talking to the other one, until all of a sudden, I think at the same time, we both went, my boss wants me to move to Albany. And so we moved up the wedding 6 weeks, and we got married, and we took the job in Albany, and we moved here. And it has been happily ever after in Albany. This is where I've lived all the rest of my time. As soon as we got married, though, there started to be weirdnesses in my marriage. My husband had trouble keeping a job. It never seemed like it was his fault. It wasn't like he was fired, but, things would just happen, and he would get laid off, or the business would close, or At one point, the state put a hiring freeze and let go of everybody that was at the lowest level, and he'd worked there for 3 weeks, We fought over strange things. Who was supposed to buy toilet paper? When we were supposed to clean out the cat litter. It was awful. And our fights escalated to a point where there was domestic violence on both sides. Because I was not going to be abused and not give it back. But most of the time we were happy. We could go months and be happy and everything was okay. And then we would have this bout of spats for a couple of days. And then my husband would sleep for 3 days. And life would go back to normal for a few months. And it just was the oddest thing. It was just weirdness. I had no idea what else to call it. I thought about filing for divorce, but God had said this was my husband. And the Bible's clear. When you get married and it's God's choice, you don't get a divorce. So I went in search of help. Marriage classes, counseling, books. I had a whole bookshelf full of how to improve your marriage books. I tried everything I knew to do, everything anybody suggested. I tried private counseling, I tried Christian counseling, I tried counseling with pastors, I tried counseling with pastors we knew, I tried counseling with pastors we didn't know. Nothing helped. I was living in instability all over again, repeating my childhood. But I stayed faithful to my marriage and God's original design. But I failed on almost a daily basis to listen to his still small voice about what I could do to make this day, this moment, better, calmer. I hadn't been trying to get pregnant, but I got pregnant. And I was excited. And my husband was anxious and edgy and wasn't sure he wanted kids. And I miscarried. Miscarried twice. By now my husband was starting to get the idea that having a child might not be a bad thing. After my second miscarriage, I heard God's still small voice. Every child born alive will serve me. That promise got me through 3 more miscarriages before they figured out what was medically wrong with me and I could have kids. Through those miscarriages, I also learned that my mom had a form of dementia called short-term memory processing disorder. She could not take information from her short-term memory and place it in her long-term memory. And this was the cause of most of the weirdness that had happened in my childhood, because this had been a lifelong issue she had had. Finally, we were able to have children. Both my husband and I had come from smaller families. I was the only girl, he was the only boy. When people would ask us how many kids we wanted to have, I would always say, well, I want everybody to have a brother and a sister. So at minimum, that's 4. 2 boys, 2 girls. Now, I had been the oldest girl in my family. My husband his oldest sibling was a girl. Everybody I knew, the oldest sibling was a girl. I did not mean to order them. I will take 2 boys and then I will take 2 girls, but that's how God gave them to me. So if you're young and you haven't had children yet, you want to make sure that you are careful in how you place the order with God. Because I was now 31 years old as I'm having my first child, and we wanted a larger family, we started having them quickly once we could figure out what was wrong, and I had 4 children in 5 years. Wow. And it actually seemed to have a fairly calming effect on my husband at the time. He loved babies. He loved playing with them. He loved tickling them. He loved counting their toes. He loved doing bath time with them. Babies were amazing. The problem is they don't stay babies. They get older. They get mouthy. They get resistant. So we were, as they got older, my husband's anxieties and issues started to reappear. And I didn't realize how bad it was because we chose to work opposite shifts so that one of us was always home with the kids and we had minimal babysitting duties. Saturdays we would sometimes hire a babysitter because my husband would work like an overnight Friday night, and I would go to work on Saturday, and we would bring a teenager in on Saturdays. But we really used very, very little childcare, and that also became an issue. But before we got to the point where we had 4 kids and all of this, I was at Faith Baptist Church in Rexford, New York. And when I was pregnant with my 3rd child, they created a part-time job there called Children's Ministry Coordinator. And since I had a degree in early childhood education and had jumped in with both feet, I was given that job at that church. I had no idea what I was doing. But God had a game plan. The day before I got the phone call that I was going to be working this job, God sat down with me and he gave me a list of this vision of what he wanted out of children's ministry in this church. And he said to me, by the time you leave, every single thing on this list will be done. And your leaving will be painful, but you're taking the job anyway. I went, what? I haven't even been offered the job and I'm leaving already? I learned so many valuable lessons in the 2.5 years I was there. And the biggest one is if you put the wrong person into a ministry role that wasn't the person God called, they're frustrated. And the person God called is also frustrated. And that lesson, more than anything else, has driven the rest of my ministry level. I never look at somebody and go, oh, you look like you'd be really good in children's ministry. Let's do that. And you could probably sing, right? We need a choir person. I don't do that. I go, what do you want to do? What's God put on your heart? If God's put that on your heart and somebody else is doing it, it's probably their time to step down. I just got to go back and talk to them and figure out. So it really altered how I handle ministry in general everywhere I go now. Now my kids were at home, and I was starting to get phone calls from them. Daddy did. Daddy did this. Daddy did that. Daddy says we have to. It was a phrase I loathed hearing from my children because I couldn't do anything. I'd go home and I'd try to talk to my husband. Look, maybe if you try this is what works for me, you'd get more cooperation. And he'd yell that I was just trying to interfere with his parenting style. So now I'm going to parenting classes because I got to figure out how to get my husband to parent well, right? So that happens, you know? Like, he could parent well, he just felt like he chose not to. And slowly the daddy and child bond snapped with all of my children. And then the mommy and child bond snapped because my children thought I didn't care. They thought I was taking my husband's side without understanding what was going on. And the fact of the matter was, I was taking my husband's side without knowing what was going on. I assumed that the man standing in front of me that day was the same man who had dreamed with me when we took those walks about helping kids who had trouble with at home and, you know, maybe opening some sort of a school for kids and that were troubled and especially kids who had parents with mental health issues. This was really his passion. And so why would that man now be having issues? It didn't make sense in my life. How many of you remember the song Lead Me? It talks about your kids are fine and they're independent. You know, I look inside the windows and I loved that song. That was my motto. My kids are independent. They are good, right? I would go off to work. My husband would, after my husband came home, everything was fine, really, because they're independent. They're cooking their own meals. They're taking care of their own stuff. They don't need to ask their dad for stuff anymore. Friday nights, they're all going out to their friends' houses to hang out for the weekend. They have lots of friends. This is good. Nope. They were hiding from the weirdness in my house. And it was bad. And I had no idea. But God kept feeding me. He kept saying, this is your husband. There's a purpose. There's a plan. Something will be happening. I stayed, but I didn't do it well. I felt unstable and confused by how something this bad was part of God's good plan for my life. I trusted God, But I also trusted pizza, Oreos, chocolate cake, and ice cream. These were the things my kids and I bonded over. Mommy brought ice cream. This is great. And, Mommy went to Stewart's and bought 4 flavors because you never knew what my kids were going to want that night. And I didn't want to be the one that didn't buy the right flavor, so we had it all. I was teaching my children the same addictive behaviors that my father had taught me. And worst of all, my husband was a type 1 diabetic. He couldn't enjoy them. I was purposely excluding him from the family enjoyment. I didn't realize it at the time, but I can see it now. In the meantime, my father had passed away. And when my dad passed away, my mom went to live with my brother, and then she would come and visit sometimes. She would tell me horrible stories about my brother's house and tell my brother nightmare stories about visiting me. Slowly, we recognized that my brothers and I recognized this is an echo of our childhood. My mother was never happy with somebody, and she was always whining to the other person about how bad that one was. I couldn't get my permit when I was 16 because my brother, who had an active alcohol problem at that point, even though I'd recovered from mine, he started his, she knew it. She wouldn't let him drive at 16, so I couldn't drive at 16. Those were the kinds of things that she was doing on a regular basis and just driving wedges in our family. Her intelligence had given her coping skills, but they weren't working anymore. And slowly my resentment for my childhood faded. I began to realize that my mom was doing the best she could under a horrific situation that nobody realized what was going on. And so I was at peace with my past in a way I had never been with before. In 2010, my husband lost his job. He was unemployed for several months, and the kids were home alone with him while I picked up some extra hours and I was trying to work more, and they became targets for his anger. I thought about reaching out to my church for help, but they had not been supportive and understanding a few years earlier when my husband went after my son at the church building, and they didn't seem to understand that that was a problem that would be potentially ongoing. I knew it would be. I said it. They called me an unsupportive wife. So I didn't go to my church. The stress escalated. Verbal abuse escalated. But instead of overeating, I was now exercising, and instead of reacting, I was praying. So I was more stable in those moments and more clear about maybe what I needed to do, but still kind of doing that, hey, God, that good plan for my life? Yeah, this not working in my world. Make this go away. So on May 20th, I was on the phone with my son, and he was telling me that he had stayed home sick. He had thrown up that morning. I told him he could stay home sick, and my husband was yelling at him to clean up the house, and he still felt nauseous. And I asked to speak to his dad, and I put his dad on the phone, and his dad talked to me, and his dad is screaming at me that his kids won't listen to me, to him, and it's all my fault. And I said, look, he's sick. Just leave him alone. Let him rest. He'll be better. We'll get the house cleaned up. This is not a crisis. And a couple more times my son called, or my husband called, and always my son was calm. And always my husband was enraged. And then on one of those phone calls, I heard my husband punch my son. And I heard my son scream, I'm going to kill you. And the phone went dead. And I was stuck just praying in the autumn. I was alone in the store. I couldn't close the store. I didn't have an employee to call in. And I'm praying, Lord, you gotta stop this. I don't know what's going on, but this can't happen. This has to stop. And a few minutes later, God says, okay, the fight's over. It's calm in the house right now. Your husband was scheduled to go visit his father tonight. He's going to go. and you're going to tell him once he leaves he can't come back. And I went, I'm a Christian. We don't get divorced. We don't do things like that. No. And God went, I didn't say divorced. I said he leaves till I tell you it's safe for him to come back. And he will come back whole and healthy if you wait it out long enough. Okay. I can kick him out. Can't be that bad. I did some research while I was at Christian marriages that are forced into separation recover in about 3 to 6 months. Oh, good. My husband will be home for Christmas. Isn't that nice? My husband had used our tax refund to prepay our mortgage so we could live for a few months while he was getting counseling and he was unemployed and all of that would happen. It was the perfect game plan. It was going to be wonderful. And then we wouldn't have weirdness in our family anymore. And I prayed and I asked God to teach me to be the wife that he would need. And I began the journey of healing. And that's when I got that Acts 27:25. Keep up your courage, because I believe that it will happen, just as you told me. In the time, though, my husband became more unpredictable. His anger rages when he's out of my house. I turned to the church and the legal system for help. The legal system has better help, but at least the church is responding better now. By the end of August, I have a refrain from order in place. That means that he cannot act violently, but he can still engage with our family. I tell him in August, I work a lot, I won't be home. This is my busy season. You can come to the house, you can see the kids, play with the kids, get connected with your kids again. When you have repaired the relationship with your children, you can talk, you and I can talk, and we can talk about repairing our marriage. By the end of September, though, he had violated that refrain from order by attacking me in marriage counseling. And he had a full-on restraining order and wasn't allowed in the house or near the kids again for a while. God's promises guided me each step of the way. I found myself in family court, in city court, in domestic violence court, and finally my husband was sent to mental health court. It was a battle. It was exhausting. And in the midst of all of it, I lost my job. Really, God? That's your good plan? 2 unemployed parents? Great. Now what? So I started looking for another job. I had a 2-year degree in early childhood education, but I had worked retail for 20 years, and I had worked my way up to being a district manager in my company. I couldn't get a job as an assistant manager in Target because I didn't have a 4-year degree. And I said, okay, God, this is ridiculous. Like, I got a 2-year degree that doesn't match what I do. I love what I do, but I can't find a job doing it now. I need help. And my brother called me up and he offered to let my mother come and live with me. And I said, y'all got that, didn't you? But he said, she's got a good pension and you can live off of her pension if she's living with you. So they sold her house that was next to my brother's and they sent her out to me. And it was a challenge and a struggle, but it brought some healing. And my mom lived with me until she passed away. And it was the best decision that I made that had moments of the most difficult moments within it. One night, I took my mentally ill child. My 3rd child had all the same symptoms my husband had, which by now we had diagnosed as bipolar disorder. And I took for those of you who didn't know, and I took my daughter to a healing service at our church. And she sat in the pew, all fidgety and edgy, and the guy that was preaching up there, Jason, he got done, he laid hands on people, there were a lot of physical and healings, a lot of depression lifted off of people, and he said, you know, if you don't come up for me to pray for you, God can still heal you in the pew. And I felt this wave of power go out of my hand and onto my daughter's shoulder. And I thought, What was that? That's weird. Well, I didn't think a whole lot about it. The next morning, my daughter got up and she said, I'm happy. I've never been happy. I think this is happy. Not really sure. I'm not angry, and I'm not sad. Said, sounds like happy. I had, in that moment, the most renewed hope that my husband would also be healed. Because I watched my daughter healed. When she sat in the pew, and I said to God, I don't want to be like this anymore. I found myself craving reading the Bible again. I put a Bible app on my phone and I started that commitment to daily Bible reading. I had done it earlier in my marriage. I would kind of go on and off with it. I would try, but it didn't always work. But that Bible app helped to keep me on track, and so that was how I would stay there daily. In the meantime, God is calling me to help others. I've been working with God. The Holy Spirit is the most wonderful counselor. He will tell you when things are bad. He will tell you when things are good. He will tell you when your answer is full of crap. And he told me a lot my answers were full of crap. He kept saying to me, this is not about your husband. This is about you. This is about you. This is about you being healed. This is about the things I want you to do. You let me worry about him, and you do you. And so I started doing me. God asked me to form a group within my church of women struggling with similar domestic violence issues, where they were married or separated from men who had claimed to be Christians but were not behaving that way. And at my first meeting, I barely spoke. I watched absolutely amazed as God began to heal broken women through each other's similar stories. And I began to realize that there is true power in our words. That when we are honest about what has happened in our lives, we get healed. God can dig in. When we try to hide it, there is nothing we can do. And so most of those women had incredible healings and peace, and I'm so grateful to God. I said, okay, if this is what you got me doing with all that pain I went through, I can live with this. I can live with that pain. Just get my husband home. After interning at the city mission, I learned that our healthcare system did not deal with health literacy well. I had gone back to college when my mom moved in, and I was studying public health. And so God placed on my heart a desire to open a business to teach people about health literacy. How do you navigate the healthcare system? How do you make good choices for yourself every single day? And I loved it. I would not have thought about it. I certainly did not want to go work for myself. I'm a single mom of 4 kids, and my husband is still not able to hold down a job, so working for myself did not sound like a great thing, but God provided all the way along. One of my first clients was a young woman who was 21 at the time, and she had what the doctors had diagnosed as anxiety since she was 12. And she called me up and she said, I know, she's a friend. She called me up, she said, I know this is an anxiety. I know it's not, and I don't know what to do. And so we sat and we talked, and one day she had one of those attacks, and I took her to the hospital. And I said, if I take you, we'll get more motion than if you just take her. And I took her to a new hospital. I took her to Albany Med instead of Ellis, where she usually was. And in 15 minutes, I had her diagnosed as having a heart problem, which she'd had since she was 12. A few years later, she had heart surgery, she recovered, she was doing great, she got pregnant, she had a kid. Her daughter had digestive problems. Her intestines were twisted. So she would eat, and if she ate really slowly, she might get the food through and she might poop, but most of the time she was vomiting everything up. And she used the skills and the tools that I had taught her to argue for better health care for her daughter, and they were able to find the problem when her daughter was 3 months old and reverse it. The doctor who did the surgery to fix it said, if you had waited another few weeks, your daughter probably would have died of starvation because she's now too big to live on the little bit that was dripping through. Those things made me so happy that this was my job, that this is what I was doing. So after a year of spending time with this group of women who were healing and recovering from domestic violence, I wasn't sure what to do next with them. We had kind of reached a point where, other than bringing more women in, we had sort of come to this stableness. And our church leadership suggested bringing in a Celebrate Recovery into our church. And I was all for it. They had realized through this process that they didn't handle things well, and that they needed to handle things better. And so I brought my group under Celebrate Recovery, which allowed us a little bit of prevention. Because when you're a domestic violence victim, why are you going to Bible study on Tuesday night that's not really advertised in the church at all, ever, anywhere? That becomes an issue. So all of a sudden, they're going to Celebrate Recovery for, their emotional issues and, their overeating and anything except what was truly going on in their lives. And I found myself here with God salving some of those small wounds, the overeating, the mental depression and anxiety that I dealt with as a teen. And it refocused me and it energized me once I was healed and clear and fine. And as more women joined my group, I was again amazed to see how quickly God heals when you share your stories, when you share those first moments of your life. I also recognized and learned that sometimes the first time you hear it from somebody else, they crash and they burn and they need some time. They run, they're not willing to deal with it. Sometimes they just freeze and they don't know what to do, that you touch something so close and personal. And so I've learned over the years to be gentle and careful when I'm talking to a woman or a man who's having trouble, but I try to keep it to women. 2 years after my separation, I was waiting for 3 of my children to serve God, and the 4th one was. I was waiting for my husband to be healthy at home. I was waiting for the financial blessings that would come from my career. I was struggling with some unhealed illnesses and injuries that I didn't allow to stop me, but it seemed to knock me out every once in a while. I had a shoulder injury and knees that were bad. I was waiting for my marriage to be all that it could be. And I had a verse that was calling my name. It's actually not up there. It's Isaiah 45:3. I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden wealth of secret places, so that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who calls you by name. Every time I entered my own secret dark places, every time I walked with a woman into hers, I saw the treasures that were buried there. I saw the chance at peace and joy and happiness that wouldn't have been theirs to begin with. And again, I just felt grateful that God let me do this. Then we had a Celebrate Recovery meeting where God made an offer. Lay down everything and it will be healed within a year. And I'm like, okay, let's take that challenge. I listed it. Physically, I was healed with asthma, allergies, a shoulder injury that had left me in chronic pain, a moderate hearing loss, high blood pressure, thyroid disorder, and high cholesterol in 5 days. Mentally, I no longer had a fear of phone calls. My husband thought it was the funniest thing, but I hated to get a phone call. I hated to make a phone call. Phones were my enemy. Gone. I was healed of feeling of being in over my head. That instability of I didn't know what was going on and I didn't understand why, and it had impacted my life, all of my life, and all of a sudden that was gone. I just felt stable. Spiritually, it broke off the fear of failing God. So often, if you've been raised in a church, there is in the back of your head this thought that you have failed God along the way. You have made too many stupid mistakes. You should have known better. You know, you look at people who just didn't hear from God, weren't saved until they were 25 or 30, or in the middle of a drug addiction at 17, and like they're on fire for God, and you're just thinking, no, I did all those things you did when I already knew God. I'm a mess. And God goes, I don't care. You're mine. I love you. Come back. Say you're sorry. Move on. Let's go. I had 2 more kids serving God, although they're not right now. And I was released from this massive demonic oppression over my household. Socially, I had improved relationships with my mother-in-law, who had never liked me. And by the time she passed away, didn't like me again. But at that moment, we had improved relationships. I had opening doors to businesses and a decision to file for my nonprofit status. And that opened the doors to the financial blessings and the stability. To go from a public health educator to a Christian author and speaker, though, was a real shift. I had waited for my husband to return and my kids to get solid with God. And God had taught me all about public health, and then he taught me all about miracles and salvations and healings. And he had me open a prayer room in downtown Schenectady. Well, somebody else owned the building. They just let me use it as a prayer room for me. It was fabulous. He challenged me to write a book on health literacy, on aging, which is what I taught on most of the time. Alyssa challenged me to write a book on prayer. So within a few weeks of each other, I had put together 2 books. I was started to be asked to speak at women's conferences. At 17, as a high school senior, I was so terrified of speaking that I am the only person who has ever graduated my high school, having taken drama class as a senior, who did not have to get on stage once. Because every time I got on stage, I messed it up so badly, the drama teacher went, I can't do this. He sent me to sound and lighting, and I made an incredible lighting, and I did all this cool stuff with sound that I never. And when he retired 4 years after that, he said, you are the only person that I have ever taught that did not get on stage. So I think it's hysterical that now I stand up here on stage all the time. No problem. In December 2015, I was in a praise and worship conference. It was wonderful. I loved this band. It was in a church that I felt comfortable in. I was ready to praise and worship, and they dance, and I love all of that. And God said, sit down. I'm going to fill you with peace. And I went, no, I want praise. And he said, sit down. I'm filling you with peace. And I sat down, and through the night, I kept trying to get back up, and he said, sit down. I'm not done. And I had peace. The most amazing sense of peace. Like, nothing could go wrong in my life. I mean, I was a single mom with 4 teenagers who liked to jump off the second floor roof of my house onto the ground for fun. I had a house full of their friends, too. My daughter Anna was having digestive issues that we couldn't identify. My daughter Jamie had been diagnosed a few months earlier with abdominal migraines. And my husband was still gone. Okay, I needed peace, but I didn't need peace like that. But I loved it for a couple of weeks. On January 9th at 9 o'clock in the morning, I got a call from our primary care doctor. Anna's gallbladder was not working at all. It had completely shut down, and she would need to have surgery to remove it. And he thought that that would cause her digestive issues. She would have to eat differently for the rest of her life. But that was it. And I said, okay, we can handle surgery. This is not a big deal. My daughter Jamie had stayed home because she was still having these horrible headaches. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she said, Mom, I really need to go see the doctor. Nothing I'm trying is working. So we went to the doctor, and she explained about how long her head had hurt and all the things she had done to try to ease the pain. And the doctor looked at me and said, this is not a typical headache. You need to take her to St. Peter's or Albany Med and find out what's going on. My daughter had been diagnosed with the abdominal migraines at Albany Med, but she had not liked their care or the attitude of the pediatric doctor that was in there at the day, so she chose to go to St. Peter's. So I drove her to St. Peter's. At 6 o'clock, we were sitting in St. Peter's. At 10:30, we were in an ambulance on the way to Albany Med because that was the only place they could do brain surgery on a 15-year-old. She had a cyst in her brain that had stopped the flow of spinal fluid down into her back. It was the cause of the abdominal migraines from 6 months earlier, almost 7 months earlier, that hadn't been caught. Seriously bad. I'm a single mom. I'm self-employed. I've got a kid having surgery, so I can't work. I've got another one who needs surgery, and Albany Med was not all about the, can we do 2 for 1? Can I just get the both of it at the same time? The doctor said his only real concern about my daughter's surgery was how close they were going to the parts of her brain that would control her emotions, and it could be a year before she was emotionally stable again. In February, Anna had her gallbladder out. My husband offered to start paying the mortgage. It was the first positive, responsible adult thing he had done in 5 years. I took him up on it. Go ahead. That's off my plate. I'm breathing comfortably. In March, Jamie was seen by ear, nose, and throat for possible cysts on her tonsils. It turned out to be tonsil stones, a minor thing, but every time my daughter got sick, they made me go to the emergency room to make sure it wasn't tied to the brain cyst in some format or another. In May, I learned my husband had not made a single mortgage payment. I spent the summer trying to work out all the issues. Jamie had been back to Albany Med twice more. My husband had begun cycling through mood swings again and was unpredictable. I tried negotiating with the bank to just take those late payments and stick them at the end so that we could get back on track, and they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it unless my husband signed the paperwork because we were both on the mortgage, and he wouldn't sign the paperwork. I tried to explain to him that this is a domestic violence situation. We're still in, there's domestic violence court. This is really bad. I just said I can't even ask him. I had asked him, but I just tried that. I can't even ask him. This is unsafe for me and my children to drag him back in, but they wouldn't do anything about it. By October, I knew I wasn't going to be able to heat my house. I had not been able to get a full mortgage payment because I was still bouncing with sick children. But I was kind of calm about that. When I kicked him out of the house, he said, I will never return to this house. I will never live in this house again with this family. And so to some extent, there was a peace about the fact that my family would be living somewhere else, so he could come home to not that house. In November, my brother, that same brother that sent my mom to me, that brother has a huge chunk of God's money in his savings accounts. And he offered to help us buy a new house. He put the house in my boys' names, they were both over 18, so that when my house went into foreclosure, that new house wouldn't be attachable. And my kids moved into a new home. We got a fresh start. The letters that were threatening foreclosure continued. I found a buyer for a short sale. On Black Friday, my kids and I went to go house shopping, and we found a house that day with an amazing real estate agent. And we needed to move immediately. And that house had been emptied 3 years earlier from the woman who owned it. She couldn't give it up. Her husband had remodeled it and then died of a heart attack a few days later. And she just couldn't give up the house, but she couldn't live in it either. So it was empty, but
Remote.
For 3 years, it had been empty. So we were able to move in quickly. We were doing a cash payment, so we didn't have to go through. So we were able to get in before the foreclosure hit. The bank rejected my short sale. I left the house empty with the heat and the water on, and I notified the bank that I would shut it off January 1st. The bank ignores my note and leaves the water running. Because I can only go in and shut off, I can only call and shut the heat off, I can't shut the water off. And the second floor bathroom pipes burst and crashes the second floor bathroom into the kitchen. And now my home that was in good shape is useless. And I'm going to lose. They're gonna sell this house for maybe $20,000 instead of the $120,000 they should have sold it for. And I'm gonna lose. And I'm gonna owe the money because they didn't do what they were supposed to. And I was frustrated, and I was angry with God. And I said, this isn't fair. But because the bank did such a poor job of handling the entire thing, including when they went to foreclosure, they didn't send me the announcement, they sent it to the real estate agent that had created the short sale, because we both had the name Karen. Yeah. The judge caught it. The judge caught that I wasn't there. The judge caught that the letters had gone to the real estate agent of the rejected short sale. And the judge said, this is all your fault. And he said, you don't know anything.
Wow.
I didn't even know that until a few years later when and somebody said, you really should look and see what you owe on that foreclosure. And I'm like, okay, I think I'm calm enough now, I can go ahead and look. And I found that it had been completely wiped out by that judge. I didn't even have to be there. God is so good. At that point, though, my peace lifts. On January 1st, I just wake up in my boy's house. My boy's now in the house I'm sleeping in. And I no longer have this massive peace. I don't feel anxious or frustrated or anything else. The peace is just gone. And I went, oh, well, that really was the worst year of my life ever, wasn't it? I went from surgeries and multiple doctor's offices to losing my house in a foreclosure. I thank you, God, for that peace, because I never really felt it. I never felt that intense anxiety that I should have felt going through the worst year of my life. So I began to ask God, now what? I don't love being self-employed. I want a full-time permanent job. He's got me continuing to write books and speaking at women's conferences. And I love that part of it. So as I'm going through and doing all of this, God sends me back to school to get my master's in theology. I totally anticipated that I would be using it to teach at Schenectady Community College. I was already teaching on health literacy and community health workers for their non-accreditation programs. And in order to teach in their accredited programs where you get, all the big college money, I have to have a master's degree. So I figured, okay, I'm getting a master's. It didn't matter what I had a master's degree in because I had a specialty in health literacy. So it didn't matter what I got my master's degree in. So I got my master's degree in theology thinking I'm going to go to work for SCCC more full-time. And that would make me happy. So God, even in that ability to move me to New Jersey, made it possible because I didn't own a house. I worked there for 15 months. I left that job on a Monday afternoon in the middle of December last year. And on Wednesday, I got a phone call from a friend of mine who said, I'm in Kenya right now, and I think you're supposed to be in Kenya too. Right away. Yes. I had never, ever, ever had a desire to go on international missions. Never. Not even a hint of it at any point in my life. But God just opened the door, and all of a sudden my heart was right there. Yeah, that's where I want to be next. Took me a while. I didn't even have a passport, so I had to go get a passport during COVID. Slows it down a little bit. But in March, I went to Kenya
Wow.
with that Alyssa person over there, who like lives in all of my stories in some way or another. I went for 5 weeks. It was amazing. I wouldn't trade that opportunity for anything in the world. And then I came back and I said, okay, God, now what? And a friend of mine in New Jersey was really, really ill, and she said, can you come help me? And I said, sure. So I moved down there and I lived with her for a couple months and helped her to get back up on her feet. And all the time I'm saying, Lord, I can't get connected into New Jersey. I don't know if it's COVID or just the way the churches are in New Jersey, but there's no gatherings and there's no groups and there's no conferences and there's no worship times and there's none of the fun stuff that I like to do when I'm, during the week. Like I can go to work, but I want to go back to New York, or I want to go somewhere. And he opened opportunities back here in New York. First, he opened the opportunity for me to become the discipleship and outreach coordinator for Converge Community Church. It is my dream job. I get to make sure that Bible studies are going off and special events are going on, and we reach out to the community and do stuff. It is my ideal job. We are a small church that shouldn't be able to pay a pastor and an outreach person, but they do. And they have bought and are remodeling and the old Tartan Lanes in Scotia. And next month we will open this brand new church building. We're doing it in phases, but we have an 11,000 square foot building to run ministry out of. I cannot imagine what God is going to do with all this space, but I really hope I get to stay here long enough to see it all, because I'm really excited about it. When I was back before I moved, I was doing a lot of partial ministry, bouncing back and forth, and one of the places that I connected with is an organization called Justice for Orphans. They brought into the Capital District a program called Care Portal that helps churches to connect to social service workers, and when the social service workers have a problem, they have a physical need for something, they notify the churches and the churches respond. It is the coolest program in the world, and many times 3 years ago I talked about whether or not I could come on board and work for them. I work for them now.
Nice. Wow.
I still teach some health literacy classes, so I still get to get my fingers involved in that here and there. It is my first women's speaking engagement since September 2019, and I am loving this one again and so excited. And I get to be in New York with my kids and my grandkids. God is so incredibly faithful.
Yes, he is. Amen.
I'm still waiting for my kids to serve God. They bounce, they go back and forth. Sometimes they're there. Most of the time they're not. I'm still waiting for my husband to come home. It's a long wait. God said he'd come home if I waited it out. So it's been a little longer than 6 months. But it was worth, I believe it will be worth the wait. I just believe that it will have to be worth the wait, because he made me wait this long. I am thoroughly enjoying what I do now. I am so grateful for every step that God has taken me in, every place he has put me, everything he has skilled me in. And I'm excited to see what he does next. And I'm most excited to see what happens tomorrow when we talk about what you should wear.